Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm very excited to have with us today two of our customers, our partners, designing Microsoft Threat Protection Stack or Microsoft 365 Threat Protection. Our marketing people keep changing the names all the time. I apologize. I'm from engineering. I'm not responsible. My name is Zvi Ben-Sheffer. I'm a program manager in the engineering team of Microsoft Threat Protection. Specifically, I work for the team responsible for the endpoint protection. But I'll be covering today the entire Microsoft Threat Protection story together with our partners, BP and Emirates. So just to set a kind of the stage of what we're trying to talk about today, what are the stories that we're going to tell and share with you. In terms of time management, so we're going to have probably half of the session. I'll try to direct some questions and get the conversation going, but it's really a session about your questions to the people here on stage, the experience that both BP and Emirates had transforming their security organization, transforming the security setup, partnering with Microsoft to actually go through that journey. So feel free to ask questions. I encourage you to think about questions during the session of how does that relate to your organization, and maybe you have more specific things. So the world is dangerous. I'll save you that. We know that. But it's not just about being dangerous. It's becoming much more sophisticated. The threats are becoming much more sophisticated. As we have more and more digital assets, then the attack surface is actually growing. And it's becoming a multi-set of places to block. If in the past we can just maybe protect on the endpoint and have a good preliminary kind of strategy, a good firewall, where we're kind of okay. But today it's coming from multiple directions, from the inside. And then it becomes a problem of correlation, a lot of data, a lot of information, and trying to understand within this huge data set what is actually a real alert, what is noise. With Microsoft, we talk about intelligent security graph. Intelligent security graph is not just a buzzword, it's a backbone for us. It's a graph of information. We spend a lot of time and effort building that capability. So for me now as an engineer, it's an amazing opportunity to actually enjoy that data set and build capabilities inside of the product that actually not only leverage that huge data set in order to correlate what we're defining that I have, let's say, on a specific solution, but actually to feed back my finding into that live living graph, and actually now all the other services can benefit of that. So think about it as a backbone of information that's now structured, and we can feed in new information and get information out of it. Since solving that area is about a lot of data, machine learning, baselining, trying to find out the outlier of that. So the bigger the data set, the better the results. So having amazing ML on a very small data set doesn't really help us solve these kind of problems. And it's that our ability at Microsoft, having that huge data set, is I think it's something that sets us apart on that. So the problem that we are trying to solve, really, if you think about what you'll hear about today, is going from a diverse set of tools, multiple tools, trying to get that into something that's more adjustable and digestible for you, okay? An integrated experience that actually takes all these tools into one place, connecting that into one correlated experience. Trying to take alert fatigue. If you think about all the solutions that you have running today and all the information coming in, even though if you have amazing orchestration like we have in Microsoft on top of a giant SIEM, you still have multiple signals coming in, and your team, your SOC team, is actually experiencing that fatigue of too much noise, and how can I read into all that? One of a very large enterprise actually was compromised. They had the signal coming in on one of the tools. So in retrospect, they actually knew that this is happening. But for months, they didn't have the capacity to have a look at that signal. So we're trying to get that and really give you correlated and quality signals. And the last thing is the task overload. So even if everything is correlated and we manage to give you quality signals? And can you investigate everything? Probably not. So how can we automate as much as we can out of that? We do that with a set of tools. We do that with the threat protection capabilities that look at identity anomalies, that look at endpoint behavior, the way the data is accessed, applications and connecting into the cloud, and of course your data center with the Azure Security Center. So with that, I want to present the two companies. We'll have a short video to kind of get you in the mood about what is the company task and what they're looking at. We'll start with a case study we just published together with BP, and then we'll follow up with some information on Emirates, and I'll ask our guests to join us shortly.
BP is about providing heat, light and mobility for a changing world. We are federated across the globe. We operate in over 80 countries. We have very complex business models. So I think BP, like every other company, is now recognized to excel in business, you have to digitally transform. Security is so important to us because we hold a cyber incident as one of BP's high priority group risks. So we've got to make sure that we are managing that information appropriately and applying the right controls around that. If you can get people to use the product consistently in a standardized way, it reduces the threat landscape. As a CISO, the greatest benefit I see from Microsoft 365 is the integrated nature of the platform, but the most important benefit is we provide our end users with a native, intuitive capability that they're going to use.
And with that, I'd like to invite Chris to join me from BP. I'll probably have a seat, so I'll stop walking around. Hi, Chris.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us. Maybe a few words about your role at BP Security.
Sure. So my job title is actually pretty long. It's Director of Security, Strategy and Architecture, but I also look after Workplace as well, which covers everything in our devices, like laptops and mobile phones and the Office 365 suite, and then rooms, so smart buildings and those sorts of things as well. So yeah, big job, keeps me occupied.
Thank you. I'd like to introduce our second company, okay, another short video, and then invite our next guest. Thank you. Vineet, I'd like to invite you to stage. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for joining.
It's a pleasure.
We need a few words maybe on your job at Emirates Security.
So my name is Vineet Bhatia. I run the Cybersecurity Operations Center at the Emirates Group. Our capability is primarily around cybersecurity threat detection, prevention, and response. And we offer this service for Emirates and Donata, which comprises the Emirates Group.
Thank you. So we're going to take it a little bit back and forth, talk about the journey for both companies. But I wanted to start with you, Chris. Maybe you can describe at the beginning just the challenges of BP in terms of IT, the complex of the environment.
Yeah, well, I think the sort of fundamental problems really revolve around sort of three things, which are about scale, speed, and security. In the annual report last year, we declared a new strategy for the company, and there's a sort of innocent thing that's called modernisation. It's one of the 4 pillars for the company, which is really about the digitisation of the entire company. You know, it's kind of looking at things like Uber or an Airbnb, those kinds of existential threats that might come along and really disrupt the oil and gas industry. And instead of kind of letting that happen to us, why not actually take control of that? And so whilst we've had the use of IT throughout the organisation for many, many years, there's a new emphasis now, really sort of building on Satch's comments about kind of tech intensity. Yeah. How do we use technology in new, novel ways, either to become more efficient, more effective, or indeed to introduce new business models? And it is kind of it is complicated because we've been on a journey to the cloud, to Azure and AWS over the last 3 or 4 years. We've been transforming our network, recognizing that investment there is needed in order to actually have performance systems on the cloud, for instance, and also deal with things like big data. We've been transforming the workplace to moving towards Windows 10 and other sort of complementary technologies. And the last sort of transformation program we've had within the IT organization is around identity, and that's something that we'll no doubt talk a lot about within this discussion. So we kind of got all these forces of sort of just the infrastructure transformation, and then layered on top of that, we're trying to build new business models with digital technologies like artificial intelligence or machine learning. In Satch's speech, you saw Royal Dutch Shell, for instance, and the sorts of things they're doing. Of course, we're doing those just as well. So yeah, I think that's the sort of fundamentals from a security perspective, is how do you scale to deal with having ever more devices and IT within the organization? And then how do you deal with the speed? How, the company wants to move really quickly with these things in order not to lose opportunity. And then from a security perspective, we know that the threat landscape is ever increasing. There's more legislation coming in, more regulation. And so we need to be able to respond to that.
I think you also mentioned when we talked earlier, you said you have that unique situation where you need to be on-prem and in the cloud in the same time. You may have a rig that goes completely offline, but you still need to protect it, needs to have all the services. Can you explain how you kind of...
Sure. Yeah, that's right. I mean, safety is the number one priority in the organization, and a lot of the systems that we run in places like rigs or refineries are safety critical. And so we're not at a place yet where we're going to start moving those kinds of operational safety critical systems into the cloud. They'll be kept on premise, but they are part of our responsibility within the security team to make sure the right things happen, that they are secure.
Right. So protecting that, can you describe a little bit how you're structured in terms of a security team? What kind of organizations you run? What is the roles of each one of them?
Yeah, so we have a kind of classic governance, risk and compliance team who look at things like legislation and board level reporting, for instance. We have a SOC, which includes areas like our emergency response team, standard sort of security operations, levels 1 and 2, forensics. And then we also have a team called Defense Systems who look after our SIM, for instance, and a lot of the different tools that we have for, say, forensics or detection. And then we also have a specialist team who deal with industrial control, so the sites, the petrochemical plants, the rigs, the refineries, the terminals, all of those sorts of things. And then quite recently, we've just formed a new team called Security Platforms, which is running and enhancing the tools that security use itself. It also has outbound services which we use or offer to other IT departments within the organization, things like PKI, for instance, or vulnerability management. And they're working very actively to secure platforms like Azure, AWS, we've got MuleSoft and Force, and that's kind of the center of expertise in sort of project discipline and the sort of wider IT ecosystem. We do also have sort of business information security, which is dealing with our engagements with leadership typically within the upstream, the downstream, trading, and our sort of back office areas, HR, procurement, all those sorts of functional areas.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask the million-dollar question, right? So you had a bet on actually believing in Microsoft as your threat protection stack or your threat protection suite of services. What fostered that decision? What was the kind of a point where you looked at where you need to head, you looked at what Microsoft is building, and you say, okay, this comes together, this is what I need for my organization?
So I think that comes back to what I was saying at the start about the scale, the speed, and the security. Where we've come from is really a history of best-of-breed tools that we end up running and integrating largely on-premise as well. And as you look at that puzzle about how do you deal with the scale and the speed, if we were to sort of continue with a best-of-breed play, that would be actually quite tricky in order for us to integrate the different signals coming from different places, be it firewalls or laptops or mobile phones or identity of servers. That's fundamentally a big data challenge behind it, and we would have to do all of the engineering behind that, all the integration, all of the correlations, the signal analysis, in order to find in a better way than we do, historically, threats and things that happen. So the real compelling proposition from my own perspective within Microsoft are the things, in fact, you were just talking about, that we're getting telemetry off things like Windows 10 from Office 365, usage patterns, Azure Active Directory. And that's, I think, a proposition that really only Microsoft have right now. And so, yeah, I'm a big supporter of the security intelligence graph, the sorts of things that, the way that underpins and solves all that big data problem that we would have had. That's a very, very compelling thing. The other part of it is usability as well. That's a big thing that we're focused on, is how do we make it really easy for people within the organization to do the right thing, to classify information, for instance, and we're using Azure Information Protection for that. How do you send secure emails? Historically, we've been using things like S-MIME, which is very complicated, a bit fragile, and a bit hokey, and now we're moving on to Office message encryption, for instance. So we're making things easier for the end user in those kinds of ways, but also for our for our IT platforms, we're able to use things like Secure Score to actually expose how well they are doing, to try and have them feel the accountability, the responsibility for actually taking action. So things like that are actually very powerful in moving forward our security posture across the entire group, not just relying on a security team like ours, but actually federating out that kind of accountability.
Yeah. So, Vineet, I want to ask you, get your perspective almost on the same set of ideas and questions. So, start from the top. Can you describe, the challenges? Probably slightly different than what BP, but still a very global organization.
Yeah, sure.
With a lot of point.
So Emirates Airline today flies to 155 cities, and then we operate in 83 countries worldwide. Donata, which does the ground handling business for us, serves 300 airlines ourselves. That means we have a workforce that is both on-prem and off-prem, off-prem meaning off-campus. We have 104,000 employees, of which roughly 40,000 employees are traveling every single day, right? What that meant for us is we would have to extend our security beyond traditional network boundaries. And that's brought us to a different challenge where we're trying to now implement security at the endpoint and where information is being created as opposed to where they're geographically located. And Microsoft 365 essentially has allowed us to get there.
Yeah. Can you describe the security organization you structured also in the same way you're running a 24/7 SOC? What are the things you have in play?
Sure. So information technology is 2,500 people. Cybersecurity works within the realm of information technology.
Yep.
We focus on everything from traditional governance, risk compliance, vulnerability assessments, compliance, and things like that. And then we also run a SOC ourselves. Interestingly enough, similar to BP, we also started a product security stream this year. So we now focus on things like avionics and in-flight entertainment systems. We're really going down the path of looking at hardware and where hardware comes from down our supply chain to make sure that we can offer the same level of assurance for hardware as we do for IT.
Yep. Thanks. Same question. Why Microsoft? How is that connect together with your plans and your vision for securing your environment?
So we started looking at Microsoft 365 when it wasn't really called Microsoft 365 during our transition from Windows 7 to Windows 10. And we remember when we were looking at the endpoint stack, we had about 3 to 4 agents running on every single endpoint at any given point in time. So it was doing the system center and configuration manager bit. We were doing endpoint protection such as antivirus products, and then we have an EDR agent. And to top it off, we were also adding a log collection agent of some sort. And then we had this endpoint space which was quite bloated, and we looked at it and said, let's do something about it, right? Because a Windows 7 machine is consuming, let's say, 15 or 20% of our resources just to do the agent management. Yep. So that was the initial starting point. What then transpired was essentially what we'd like to call living off the land for defense. And what we achieved as a result of that was looking at the native capabilities of Windows 10 and implementing those security capabilities out of the box. That allowed us to then look at what the residual gaps were to identify what needed to be done to fix some of those things. And that's how we came across Windows Defender ETP, and that was sort of the first foray into it. I mean, we had migrated from Postini back in the days to Office 365 a while ago. So we were doing the cloud migrations for the end user mailboxes and things like that. But it all started to come together once we moved to Windows 10 and WDATP.
Okay, thank you very much. Sure. Chris, another question maybe for you. So after you bet on that stack, on that solution, you implemented that in your environment. How did that impact basically two things? So your day-by-day of security in terms of productivity of being able to actually identify threat and response, but also the productivity of people, because we're talking about a lot of security measures. So have you managed to balance that?
Yeah, so we're still on a journey there, quite frankly. We are using the WDATP stack on Windows 10, practically everything that comes with that. But in the Azure side of it, we're still playing around with quite a lot of the different technologies, although we've got good story around things we're doing with identity, conditional access, MCAS, those sorts of things. I think in terms of productivity, I think it's at least allowing us to stay still, which might not sound that great, but the capability that we're getting, the things that we're able to see, the enhancements to our security posture are getting better without us necessarily having to add on people, if you see what I'm trying to get at. So I think that it is the way that the platform works as a PaaS rather than something that we're having to build and integrate is allowing us to deliver things much faster than we were previously.
Yep. So I wanted to talk about something we talked about earlier. You said Azure Active Directory, moving to that, implementing conditional access. Talk maybe about, why was that really important for you to implement? What did this allow you now today in terms of user access to data and your controls and security? Yeah,
well, if you've attended any of the security talks this week, there's been a big theme about multi-factor authentication.
Yes, it was.
And that's really the thing that, moving to Azure Active Directory is the thing that's allowed us to do that. And we apply that across all of the Office suite, for instance, Office 365, and on our devices. And I don't think that we would have done that, quite frankly, without Azure Active Directory. The thing that I like about Azure Active Directory is actually really the integration into conditional access and MCAS, and being able to set different policies about people's access, about whether the person themselves has been exhibiting risky behavior, whether the device is kind of known, the location they're coming from, and the things that they're trying to access, and making a much better judgment about whether or not the access is appropriate. I mean, that's moved us forward a long way compared to where we were before, just an authentication which either works or it doesn't work, having different signals about the device and the user and the data access, and being able to change the authentication and step it up where people are trying to access really sensitive data, for instance, is, I think, moved our security forward quite a bit.
Yep. And we just announced this time, we just added now the actually poster of the machine. So if you have an active alert on your machine, we will actually raise the two-factor authentication or block the user from accessing the data. So it's not just the baseline of the device, it is patched or secured, it's actually once you have an active threat on the machine, we can prevent the user from accessing the data, and automation will kick in, clear the machine, and then the user can access data again. So taking it to the next level with that. You talked about Azure Security Center, the ease of use, the intuitive way the data is presented back to you, so you can get a whole idea about your hybrid data center.
Yep.
You've been part of the design, helping us kind of build that. You use that in terms of getting a better form. Do you feel that you're actually getting a better security layer, if you want standard now, better security posture out of your data center?
Yeah, we're using Azure Security Center, in its simplest format for things like Secure Score, being able to see kind of where we are. Well, the thing I really like about Secure Score is that it's not a passive, it's active. It's kind of, here are things you can actually do to improve your security posture. We've had a tool called the Cyber Barometer, which tracks sort of user behavior, phishing, and user behavior on whereabouts they're traveling on the web, for instance. But it's never had that kind of recommendation behind it. So that's kind of one thing about Azure Security Center. And then when we come across sort of different incidents, there's tools within there like network mapping, for instance, where you can see where people have perhaps traversed the network after a brute force, as an example. And we're also using things like Azure Policy to detect situations like inappropriate ports being exposed to the internet, and then actually drive automatic remediation to close down those gaps, however they sort of came about.
Thanks. Vinit, I want to leverage your experience running a SOC, implementing our tools. So you went from multiple agents on an endpoint into a single agent, selected us as that solution. How has that changed the way you're looking at the information coming from the endpoint, managing all these solutions?
I think it's predominantly efficiency. So we were driving efficiencies around cutting down 30 to 35% of resource utilization across the agents. And we'd spend time and money trying to converge all of the information coming from all of these agents and disconnect the data sources to try and make sense of what was an incident versus what really wasn't an incident. Of course, with the improved efficiencies, we were able to cut down on threat detection times. So the average threat detection times within the industry today are on an average of 200 days. We're well past those numbers, and we're currently in the hours. Similarly, with threat response times, we're down to less than a day today. And what that means for us is that the system on itself is able to identify incidents that need to be triaged and responded to. And once the automatic triage has been done, an automatic remediation activity also takes place. That frees up a lot of time for the analysts to really focus on incidents that they should be working on, as opposed to dealing with things like Trojan downloaders and things like that, right? So the mundane security incidents go away, and really you're focusing on high signal, low noise incidents that definitely need an L3 agent to go and look at it. So efficiency, and then really signal to noise ratio.
So another question maybe on that will be more on the quality. So you took a lot of agents that have a very specific role. They're very deep in what their knowledge, do you feel we improved the quality of the signal of what we're getting out of the box? So we have very deep optics into the OS. Does that promise come in life? Do you see better optics?
Yeah, I mean, so we started 2 years ago looking at WDATP, and we became a design partner with Microsoft to try and expose some of the information that was lying within the Windows subsystem and APIs, to expose them to the analysts. What that allowed the analysts to do is start querying information within the Windows subsystem that was not normally visible to endpoint production products, right? With those APIs then exposed, it allowed our agents to go out and write queries to identify threats that were quite unique to us, to our region, or to our industry as such. And when those alerts were being picked up, those were alerts that definitely needed someone to go and look at them, right? The module is called Advanced Hunting now. So if you go into WDATP, it provides a schema of backend artifacts that you can start to query, that might be registry artifacts, network artifacts, so on and so forth. And you can write a custom query that allows you to go deep into the system and look at certain parameters and really flag what is relevant to you. So that's been a blessing.
Maybe it's a place to thank both of your teams. I think when we developed advanced hunting tools, which basically reflects back the entire data set of everything we pick up of your endpoints back to your security team, so you can actually hunt across the data and have your free kind of capability to design your own traps. It came as a feedback from your team, so we were building the user interface, and the security teams were looking for one step deeper and said, okay, let's take the entire data set, give you elastic quick search on top of that. We're taking it to the next stage now. We actually announced that you can actually write your own, if you want, alerts and traps by actually scheduling a query and allowing that to result in an alert that you define the severity, and then further on down the road, connect that to a playbook of automation. How important is that for you to be able to write your own traps? What's special in that versus only building on what we generalize and see in the clouds?
It's quite significant. If you look at how Windows Defender ATP works and how traditional hunting is carried out on networks, you would have the Defender agent perform the run-of-the-mill attack analysis, and it would tell you that, hey, I've detected this on an endpoint that's doing this, right? But then you would also have the SOC that is aware of TLP red notices or TLP amber notices that have come out that are quite unique, and they've been flagged in the industry only 4 or 5 times. And that information is generally not available to other companies. That information is not generally available to your own Graph API, as an example. What it allows us to do is it allows us to then write a search query which maps against the intelligence that we've received and schedule that out. And so if a machine is offline today, it comes back online 15 minutes later, the scheduled query goes back and runs, right? So we're trying also to solve the problem of time drift against logs. When you have 100,000 machines that are never going to be online at the same given point in time, and you're collecting logs every 15 minutes, that T minus 15 minutes is never the same for every single asset, right? So an asset that is in North America will never be online the same time that is online in Middle East. And so that time drift creates a problem for us to go back and retroactively look at activities that have taken place and identify that they've actually taken place. So scheduled queries allows us to go and deal with those sorts of problems, where machines are not necessarily online. The moment they come online, they send the telemetry data back in, and then the scheduled queries start to tell you that, hey, this happened in this particular location.
Thanks. A question of automation. Also, I don't know, we got a lot of feedback from your teams when building that. We implemented that in the product about 6 months ago. You're starting to kind of test it out in a larger scale. It's a step of faith right into a system which automatically goes and investigates the problem and then applies a remediation. How is that going to change the way you work? Do you believe that can be completely implemented? Do you believe eventually you can trust and let us actually go and save a lot of that time and do stuff alone?
I mean, from the SOC perspective, we actually have a KPI that we track, which is called the L0Q automation. So our analysts are spread from L1 to L4, and L1 being traditional help desk agents who receive an incident or an alert, and they decide whether it's an incident or not. We have a metric that we track, which is 10% of all monthly incidents that we're now trying to automate into the L0Q. The L0Q is essentially a system of correlation that looks at events and activities that are taking place across the system, looks at the telemetry data that's coming in, looks at all of the intelligence that's coming out of the Graph API, and identifies when an event is agents based on that. So security agents based on that. So security agents based on that. So security orchestration out of incident generation is quite significant within our workspace as well. We process about 10 terabytes of log data every single day. And that means we have to deal with upwards of 20,000 incidents a week. There's really no way for us to keep up everything and then meet an SLA or a commitment of upwards of 95%. And automation allows us to do that, essentially, right? So we're down the path of trying to tune the system to identify what really is an incident and then take action on it automatically. And you're left with about 30 to 35% of incidents that humans look at.
So we're putting a lot of effort in taking that automation to the next level, and basically now, for example, taking an alert that starts in Office, starts from a phishing, incriminating maybe a user or maybe a few endpoints, and then automatically have the investigation kick in on the endpoint and go and remediate that. You haven't deployed yet the full stack of all our advanced protection capabilities. What's next? What's on your, what's the next piece of the puzzle that you're going to fire up?
So we're very close now to activating MCAS, which is the Microsoft Cloud Access Security. We've been using the detective capabilities of MCAS for about a year or so. We're now going down the path of identifying what's sanctioned and unsanctioned applications, and essentially have the cloud without logs go and take action on unsanctioned applications. What that does for us is, again, a form of automation where we really don't have someone to go and say, hey, you're trying to upload data to Dropbox when you're not essentially allowed to. System identifies it and then takes action. So MCAS is the next thing that we're quite keenly working on. With GDPR and some of the other regulations, we're very actively working on AIP, so Azure Information Protection and Windows Information Protection. We've gone down the path of starting to automatically label data. That's, I guess, the first step when you go down the DLP route. So our systems are going down the path of identifying data when it gets created, and that might be at the endpoint, or it might be in the cloud on SharePoint Online, or via emails when they come in. So a few things there. We're also quite excited to see the developments in the Azure Security Center. So we have a cloud-first strategy ourselves. We're rolling out across AWS and Azure quite significantly. And Azure Security Center has taken away all of the work that needs to be done to automate and build new use cases. So the Azure Log Analytics, or the OMS agent on these assets that are being spun up in Azure, provide all of that telemetry data back into Azure Security Center, and then it goes back and identifies what needs to be taken down. Yeah.
Thanks. Chris, you did implement MCAS.
We have, yes.
Yes, you talked about use cases when we talked before. So how does that help you?
Yeah, we are not actually doing the network logs yet, but that's something we are just starting up and working with. We're using it really in this authentication scenario where we're looking at particularly the most significant applications we have within the estate, and then having sort of different rules around the security posture about who it is who's trying to access it, their sort of risk history, where they're coming from the device, and then making sort of on-the-fly decision about whether to allow access to the typically SaaS-based applications. We're also using it for sort of data loss prevention as well, so blocking the download of files, for instance.
Okay, thank you. Before we turn it over and kind of ask more questions, I have the same question to both of you. Appreciate a candid answer. We've been partners on that for a long time. We're investing a lot and betting and connecting all these threat protection services together via the graph, but via also connected scenarios, automation across these units. So basically building, if you want, a live fabric. So one service reacts in real time to the other, learns from the other. If we block one thing here, it automatically gets blocked here. If we've incriminated the user ID, we can now go and investigate across all the machines it was logged in automatically, and maybe restrict his access to stuff. All this is becoming like a live fabric. Some of our competitors, and most of our competitors, are not following that. We are betting in that direction of connecting that. Yes, no, where do you see us heading, Chris?
Yeah, I think really good things are happening, and I'd like to see that kind of connectivity expanded. One of the areas, coming back to where we started, is for a company like BP, we have a lot of industrial control systems, for instance, and opening up the graph and allowing telemetry from sort of those kinds of systems, I think would be pretty interesting from my own perspective as somewhere to go next, because the coverage we've got there is pretty limited actually from a detection and correlation perspective. So that would be a good thing.
So pulling in additional sources outside of our suite. Okay. Your feedback to us, what should we invest next?
Yeah, so I guess the security fabric first, right? So the security fabric for me is quite significant because the SOC is essentially dependent on identifying incidents early and then remediating them as efficiently as possible. So the security fabric is allowing us to do that. In terms of what we see next as something that's quite significant is, of course, the identity space. We'd love to see conditional access coming to the B2C environment. So conditional access today is predominantly focused on identifying whether our employees are coming in with the right assets, are coming in with the right identification, and so on and so forth. We're quite keen to see the risk scoring engine that comes out within the Azure Identity B2C space. So that's one. And to be honest, I think WDATP has gone through leaps and bounds of evolution. But there's other threats that are coming up quite rapidly down the road, and we need to start leveraging the Graph API as much as possible.
Yeah, I think you also, when we talked, you said as a security center, also pull in data sets from also other data sets, maybe being able to correlate more than just what we're able to feed. So we hear that. I appreciate your candid input. Thank you for that. Questions? Will really great. Anything that you heard here that you want to reflect maybe on your environment, or now's the time. Yeah, the mics here. Great, thanks.
So my question is related to the situation of best of breed on the client side, where you have the various agents from the different vendors, and the decision to switch to the Microsoft tools. We're in the process of going through that evaluation, and the question becomes, well, we want to have some kind of independent party on the device, but then we get all this feedback from the end user stating my machine is slower. As you stated, you have more incidents that are being worked on just related to performance on the machine, not necessarily working on security related signal. So what was a key driver to consolidating to the Microsoft stack on the client?
Maybe you want to take that. You did some performance tests.
Yeah, so the WD-ATP agent, when it started out about 2 years ago, was only good at catching about 60-65% of what we were throwing at it. So we went down the path of looking at really what other agents were there to compensate the rest of the 30-35%. And as we went down the evaluation path, we started engaging Microsoft and providing that feedback and said, look, here's what we see and here's what the agent doesn't really see today. What can you do to make it better? And as an evolution of that over the course of, let's say, 8 months when our evaluations ran, we already saw 10 to 15% based on our feedback, right? So it went from 65% upwards to about 80%. And we were quite satisfied with that, because that showed us the willingness of Microsoft to accept some of the feedback that we were giving and try and enhance the product. Cut to 2 years from then, I think we're close to about 87% of what we throw at it. Our teams write our own malware internally, so we're throwing things that are coming out in the wild. We're trying to test the system regularly. We do very active red team, blue team assessments, so we have an aggressive red team that goes out and tests systems against the default security stack to see if it's really working. And we're quite satisfied at this given point in time to say we've consolidated the endpoint protection stack as well as the endpoint detection and response stack. And we're complementing some of the gaps that are around detecting the what I'd call zero-hour infections with advanced hunting, right? And over the course of the last 6 months as well, if you've been following the WD-ATP security blog, you will see that within Emirates at least, we've found 3 zero-hour attempts that were picked up within the 0 hour, not by agents that we've deployed or not by our own analysts. It was picked up by the machine learning engine in the cloud, right? So the WD-ATP engine, when it's consuming all of that telemetry data, is not just doing nothing with it, right? It's going to the cloud, it's identifying what attributes are potentially malicious, correlating it with what it's already seeing, and it's giving you an actionable insight. And I think that's quite significant. There isn't any other product right now that is having the visibility of endpoints across millions and millions of Windows machines worldwide.
Thank you.
I might give a slightly different answer to that, which is when we were going through the evaluation, we were trying to take a sort of full stack view about a comparison of Windows 7 to Windows 10. And I think you can get quite obsessed with the agents, but what you probably need to do is really understand how the operating system works and the capabilities within it. So where we had agents, for instance, which were doing application whitelisting, blacklisting, you don't need an agent for that, because that's now part of the base functionality of Windows 10. And so you sort of go down each of the use cases for the agent, and you can eliminate, practically every one of them in our case. Yeah.
Thanks.
Have you detected a betterment, if you will, of your time to resolution using this solution?
Yeah, I mean, I think we published a case study earlier this week where we officially came out and said that our response times are down to less than a day. Our detection times are in the hours today. And quite honestly, that's been possible because we've been able to automate some of the functions around it, right? So we have about 50,000, 40,000 machines that are currently sending telemetry data into the WDATP cloud, now that it supports Windows 7 as well. And we're looking at the data coming in, and we're able to take decisions based on what we've already configured as potential threats, right? So the system takes care of 60-65% of it. We have about 30% which are custom use cases that we're writing, and the system continues to hunt across them, right? So your visibility is significant, the data that's coming in is significant, and then the system is taking decisions based on what you've already told it to take them. I think the threat detection times are quite variable depending on who you ask and in which vertical and what industry they're in. I think if you were to deploy it strictly within a lab, you would see significantly different results. Out in the field, it's close to what we see.
Good, and you're...
Well, Chris, I wanted to ask, to expand on your question, because your team has been one of the most aggressive teams in terms of pushing us for time to detect. Was running a team, you're talking already in minutes, and now you're talking with us on seconds.
Yeah.
Are we there yet? Are you ever going to be
close.
satisfied? Getting close?
Not quite, no.
So what's your, you have a very aggressive time to resolution in terms of at least vetting bad or benign. What is that, and what kind of time span you talk?
Actually, I don't know exactly what we're looking for there. I'd have to engage with our SOC team actually to give the sort of right answer.
So they've been pushing us from minutes down to seconds now, so that's it's the new language. It's near real time. But you had another question?
Yeah, if you've analyst satisfaction.
Oh.
That's a big one, right? I think it's remarkably better than what it was 2.5 years ago. It's the signal-to-noise ratio. That's essentially what analysts care about. The system itself is enriching the data based on what it's getting now from Microsoft 365. So we have now a converged view because of the Graph API. Our system is able to get the information that comes out of WDATP. It's able to correlate the information that's coming from Azure Security Center. Microsoft 365 has other features online. And what it allows us to do is really quickly triage an incident and say if it's really an incident or not. And having that single pane of glass helps us to reduce the noise. That's quite important because before this, we had multiple agents and we'd have to depend on the integration across these multiple agents. They were pulling at different frequencies, they were coming in through different channels. You could write a query that was not going to be universally applied across all the agents because the schemas were different, so on and so forth, right? And once all this information comes back in and it's all speaking the same language, it's quite easy for us to triage the incident. So I think personally the analyst satisfaction has gone up significantly. That's also visible because the signal-to-noise ratio, we track them via the false positive resolution codes on the incidents, and they're significantly down as well. Thank you.
Thanks. A question?
Thank you. I come from a very small company. I would call it a pico company compared to some of you guys. But nevertheless, when I hear you speak, we have the same challenges, but we don't have the same, we don't run a SOC and that kind of thing. So we have about 200 employees. We're a small bank with a big footprint in terms of the Caribbean region. My question really surrounds the whole question about the single pane of glass because I'm still missing something. So for example, when you look at threats like really targeted phishing, which we start to see an increase in frequency, and then you look at all these signals, the whole question of getting that in one place is still, I'm not too sure where that is. I'm hearing about MCAS, but could you just give me a quick rundown about how you think a small company could have the same or similar type capabilities leveraging the Microsoft in Azure environment? Is that something that you could discuss here?
Yeah, I can describe the journey and where we're aiming and where we're at. It's not a straightforward problem set to solve. So if you think about the journey we started building solutions to solve various specific problems, right? Identity anomaly, email phishing, endpoint protection. Some of these were, right, acquisitions, something we build in-house. So we started there. We understood at that point that the collective data of all these systems is much bigger than just connecting them together. So even deeper than just having a single point of view, really being able to share all this data and then build the Microsoft Intelligent Security Graph. And now pulling it together into a single interface. So we just announced M365 Security Center, which is the first time you'll actually be able to pull our advanced threat protection or threat protection, now we call them, capabilities across the email, the inbox, and the identity. Azure will be the place where you look at, Azure Security Center will be the place where you get a single point of view into everything data center, so your hybrid solution, whatever you plug into that. I think if you look at these 2 points of view, one of them will give you the entire security posture of your data center, which will be the Azure Security Center. And the M365 threat protection dashboard, if you want, will give you one place of correlating all your alerts, the baseline of your environment, the secure score of all the different environments. So even for a small organization, or even I would say, especially for a small organization, it's very valuable to get that all in one place. You definitely don't have the resources of trying to engineer and stitch all these things together. So I have a link at the end. I urge you to go and look at resources and trial this environment, and that's how it works.
The only thing that I'd add is, I think the product is significantly more important for smaller organizations because it's been built on the experience of significantly larger ones. And what that means is that you do not have to necessarily spend the same amount of resources and time to get the same security benefit as opposed to somebody else who's starting out fresh and trying to implement new products. And that's quite significant because the end goal of a small business is to run the business, right? They really don't want to be focusing on running IT or running security as such. And Office 365, if you look at the ATP product out of the box and to the use case that you specified around phishing, it's quite simple, right? An email comes in, an email contains a link. Office 365 ATP will automatically rewrite the link, irrespective of what that link is. And that email goes and sits in the user's mailbox. The user opens the email and he clicks on the link. Now, at that given point in time, when the traffic goes out to that link, Office 365 ATP will take a decision whether or not that link is malicious at that given point in time, as opposed to when the email actually comes in, right? And when a user really clicks on something that's malicious, the admin gets an alert which says, hey, somebody clicked on something that was malicious. Maybe you want to go and see how many other people got the same email, right? And protection.office.com allows you to go and query every single email that flows within your organization as well. So tools are available out of the box. It's quite significant because it's been built on the experience of companies that have been seeing thousands and thousands of incidents per day. And really, it's a simple click and drag and drop.
Thanks.
This question probably to the gentleman from Emirates. Apart from the Microsoft stack for your security, I'm sure you would have other partners, platforms for addressing other security vectors, maybe network, email, or even mobile or whatever. So wanted to understand if these other platforms are exploiting the APIs that the Microsoft exposes, the graph APIs that we expose, or you have a plan to bring some sort of a consortium approach to get these partners to work on the signals so that you can have from a single, from an analyst standpoint, a single pane of glass to look at.
So I was having that conversation just today, yesterday actually. I was walking down the expo hall and I saw Graph API doing 5 more things that I wanted. And I said, really, I'm starting to get greedy now with Graph API. Can I start throwing my own custom applications to the Graph API? And the guy said, well, actually, it is possible for you to start using ADAL or now Microsoft Authentication Libraries to say, if you enroll your applications to MSAL, you can then get the visibility of them within the Azure platform and then hence into Azure Security Center. But coming back to answer your question, the product today is primarily Microsoft specific, but that doesn't stop us from integrating that product into what we call a SIEM, Security Incident and Event Management System. So if you have something like Splunk, or you have Oxide, or if you have even Microsoft's own BI intelligence tool, and you try to bring all of that data back in, you can start to spin up APIs once the data has come back in. So to give you an example, if I see a user clicking on a link and the link downloads a Word file, that Word file opens a network connection to, as an example, a third-party command and control server. What that will do for me is that information will flow into the SIEM. The SIEM will get other information from other syslog sources, might be a firewall log, might be a network sandbox log, something of that sort, and says, look, this happened and then traffic went out, and here is now the correlated incident for you to look across multiple data sources. So that's essentially the job of the SIEM. I'm seeing a few things coming out of the Azure Log Analytics space, which might sort of answer the question in the near future, but it's not there yet. But traditionally, these things are done by SIEM solutions.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks. Yep, there's two more coming up.
Question from my side related to your line of business applications. I know you're using Office 365, the ADA libraries and all those things come standard in them. To what level of line of business applications do you have in ADAL?
What was the last bit, sorry?
Do you use ADAL for, or what level of line of business applications do you integrate into Azure AD actually?
Yes, we've probably integrated around about 150 applications now. Some of those are on-prem client-based applications, actually, which BP have written for geophysics, for instance. Some of them are SaaS applications. Office 365 is obviously the case, but then Force as well, as an example. And I think that's one of the interesting things about Azure Active Directory. As long as you've got the authentication through AAD, you can really do some really interesting things with conditional access and MCAS. The really important thing is just to sort of be insistent on using AAD as the authentication engine, and then all this functionality actually behind exists for actually any use case.
Just on top of that, you still use ADFS, or is ADFS a non-existent play in your world?
We don't use ADFS. Yeah, we were actually, funny enough, on a project to implement that last year, and we got actually just to the end about to implement it, and then working with the AAD team, they announced a new feature, I can't remember what it was called, which meant that wasn't necessary, so we actually killed that project, and yeah, so that we don't use it.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, when you put in ATP from obviously that conception to production, how big was your SecOps team to put it in place until you reached initial operating capability?
I think we started about 14 people doing this, and we're about 20 people. But then if you really look at the amount of malware incidents back then versus the malware incidents that we're dealing with now, I'd say about 60% of those malware incidents have been automated. So run-of-the-mill malware that comes in via the USB, it's people clicking on funny links on the internet and things like that. It's stuff that's already bypassed 4 or 5 filters of security. So it might be the email filters, might be the spam filters, might be the web proxy filters, so on and so forth. And really you're waiting on incidents that come in when somebody picks up a funny USB and they've transferred something from their home computers to the work computers. And all of that gets dealt with automatically, right? So we're down about 65% of malware incidents that were there essentially, but then the individuals are more focused on dealing with incidents that really matter, right? So they're looking at threat intelligence and writing advanced hunting use cases, or they're focused on identifying when command and control behavior takes place and funny malicious traffic goes out and things like that. So the people remain the same, it's just efficiency, and we're driving the right behaviors within the organization.
Okay. So one other question. With regards to sort of user education, so there are some things in Office 365 and Microsoft 365 ATP that sort of spins around what you've been educating users to teach. So safe links. Yeah. For years we've been telling users if the link doesn't look the same that you expect it to. But now Microsoft completely changes that link. Yeah. How much education did you have to put into the end user to sort of accept this? Or did they just click?
That's quite an irritating problem, I can tell you, right? And it's exactly what you said, right? We've always told people, well, if the link doesn't look right, don't click on it, right? And now they start to hover over the link and they say, oh, well, it all says safe protect or safe protect outbound URL and things like that. And it is causing problems, I can tell you that, right? I was having a conversation with Milad earlier yesterday, and I said, well, what's going on? And he said, well, we got this phishing incident, and we didn't know if it was really a malicious incident or not, so people have started clicking on it within the VMs. People are going and clicking on it in third-party sandbox URLs and things like that just to see what's going on behind. But really that implicit trust of allowing a URL that has been rewritten by a proxy and hoping that the proxy will block that just in time is a little bit too much for me. So there's a problem there, I tell you.
What about BP?
Say again?
What about at BP?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, actually. Make it a bit more generic, because we've been on really a program of continuous deployment of different things like MFA, for instance, or the AIP client. And we had an interesting exchange with one of the big telcos quite recently, and they were actually waiting for a situation where all of the technology on Windows 10 around AIP and the other add-in, I can't remember, but they were kind of waiting for everything to work in lockstep together, and they were basically frozen. So I think this kind of continuous change culture, you've just kind of got to get used to it and deal with the ongoing communications as you move forward with different security sort of things. I'll come back to what I was saying earlier. Usability is really important to us, and things like the converged experience now on SSPR and the authentication is making things a lot easier. And we also saw this week that AIP has been integrated into the RIB directly rather than a sort of add-on. Those little things actually make a big difference. But I think, at least for us, we've been on a continuous journey rather than one which is sort of just a point in time. We're just going to release Windows 10 in a fully formed perfect. That's not how kind of IT works now.
Okay, thanks.
Hi. So in my environment, we have a highly secure organization. Well, everyone says that, right? But, so when assets get compromised, they can't do command and control because of the way our network is architected and the endpoint. So when I get AV alerts, it's hard for me to determine if this is custom malware that might work around our controls or something. So I'm curious, in your organization, you probably have certain lockdown networks that you want to monitor because there's critical stuff there. How do you differentiate between something that's just like a run-of-the-mill malware where it's probably not going to get out because your infrastructure versus something that's a more advanced threat?
So that's essentially the difference between EPP and EDR. So EPP is endpoint protection, and that's your run-of-the-mill antivirus. EDR, on the other hand, is endpoint detection and response, and that gives you visibility down to the kernel. And so if you see a malware incident, you want to be able to drill down and ask, hey, what caused the incident? Was it a binary that came from an internet source? Was it coming from the email? What was the parent process? What were the child processes? And really, if the child processes spun out some network connections, on what protocol they were. So if it's an HTTP or an HTTPS traffic that's going out to a funny domain that's ending in .gr, as an example, you want to go and investigate. Or if it's Excel starting out DNS traffic to the internet, Excel doesn't do that. You want to go look at it, right? So that's essentially the difference between EPP and EDR, and this is why something like WDATP converges that information, right? So when you get an alert into a WDATP console, it will drill down to the process and it will tell you that this particular process appears to be malicious because somebody clicked on a link inside a Word file which spun up a network process which went out to the internet on this protocol, as an example. And that allows you to very quickly triage an incident to say, hey, wait a minute, I shouldn't see Excel sending DNS traffic to the internet. And that's the difference essentially between EPP and EDR.
And are you getting when you did a comparison between Windows Defender, ATP, and other EDR solutions, was your main motivator towards going with Defender ATP that it's all integrated in one solution?
No, to be honest, it didn't start out that way. I mean, we were quite heavily dependent upon being able to query the Windows subsystem APIs, right? As an example, I wanted to see if a process was running from System 32, or I wanted to see if a process was downloaded from the internet and then run within the context of the user and things like that, right? So the ability to extract that metadata information from the Windows subsystem what was driving our EDR selection process. It just happened to be that we provided this feedback to Microsoft. They asked us, hey, what does your schema look like? And we said, here's what our schema looks like. There's 250 touch points that we'd like to be able to query and write our queries on. And they said, great, give us 6 months. That's how Advanced Hunting was born.
Thank you.
finding now with, you talk about seeing the whole chain of events from the process being spawned and where it's going to, are you seeing diminished value in sort of those, firewalls doing IPS and things of that nature? Are you seeing that value diminish, and are you having more and more conversations around maybe getting rid of them if you had them, or not necessarily putting them in new instances? Or
That's a great question if you ask me.
Think about maybe the zero trust network.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. So the zero trust model is essentially that, right? You want to move away from having a boundary on your network, right? And that's essentially what we're trying to do. Because the focus is now on protecting the endpoint and the user as such, a user could be anywhere in the world, right? So I could spin up my machine here, and if I'm connecting on a network that's not really sanitized or clean, it really doesn't matter, because whether or not that network has a firewall, I am still protecting my endpoint. And that is the vision down the path of going to conditional access, or what others call zero trust models, right? That is the future. We're going down that path as well. It's just a journey, right, to get there. There's legacy applications that you need to migrate. There's a lot of network re-architecture that's required. And the ability to classify everything that's inside your data center as a trusted zone, and everything else outside of the data center, including your user space, as untrusted, is quite significant. Because then it starts to differentiate between what you can do with data when you're inside the network versus outside the network, right? So even when you're on a campus network, some of the other companies, such as Google, implemented Beyond Corp, and they said, even when our employees are on campus, they don't necessarily have a different privilege than when they're outside traveling, as an example, right? And application proxies and things like that are quite instrumental in driving that sort of change, but we need to get there. It's a journey.
And I'd say we're still focused pretty heavily on the network security. Whilst it's convenient that things like Windows 10 have an ATP agent on it, we do have Internet of Things, industrial control systems, other devices. So it's kind of standard defense in depth to look at the different sort of ways in and things that might happen and have the right controls in different places.
Thank you. Yeah. So we have, we're doing our Windows 7 to Windows 10 migration. We've kept our agents consistent from Windows 7 to Windows 10. And I guess my question is, we haven't embraced the cloud. What's our roadmap to start using these tools? Can we replace, can we only put them on the Windows 10? Do we have to embrace the cloud? What's our next steps?
Well, it's really simple. If you've got the ATP agent on, then that comes with the portal, and the telemetry starts reporting straight away, and it's as simple as that. You just log on to securitycenter.microsoft.com, and away you go.
That's essentially that, right? So you run a batch script, and then that's it.
And that will work on Windows 7?
Yes.
Now we backported, so I'll touch about a little bit difference. You will need to install an agent on Windows 7 because we didn't bake it into the OS. So we basically took the sensor and built it as an installable you can run on Windows 7. And you can see that in a matter of minutes. Once you run that, you will get the data starting going to the portal. There's another aspect to that on Windows 10, maybe I got your question right, is as you move to Windows 10, it's a point in time to evaluate what are the agents that you actually don't need anymore because you have that built out of the box. Like you said, being able to whitelist and blacklist applications, it's built out of the box. Advanced, attack surface reduction rules are built into Windows 10 where you don't need a lot of these capabilities. So as you move over, I urge you to look at the capabilities that you were using with multiple agents on 7 and see what you can actually get a lighter endpoint, invest less resources in that, managing it, paying for the licenses, but also from the performance of the endpoint, free it up because we worked very hard to build it into the OS.
And the suite of products, though, it's not dependent on us having like Azure AD and all those kind of tools.
Not necessarily.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah. One more? Yeah, we have 4 minutes and 40 seconds go.
One last question.
Yes.
How do you handle Macs?
So we have, just relatively recently, experimenting with Intune for enrollment there. And it was announced this week that Intune will have the ATP in it as well, I think.
And we currently partner with the third parties to consume their signals in the cloud, so you can run some of our partner solutions as an agent, as an EDR, an EPP agent on the Mac. We'll consume it, so you will get the same correlation of data. You'll be able to investigate and get all that richness in one place, but you will need to run a third-party agent for that.
But you could also do System Center endpoint protection today on Macs.
Yeah.
So that's available today, and if you do Intune for Mac plus SCEP, that's available out of the box.
Yep. Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the great questions. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Vinit.
Thank you.
For that.